Well, good evening. I'm going to talk about some of the dialogues that Jung had with his soul during the course of his writing the Red Book. And as you know, it's a very large piece of work, so it's quite difficult to know what to select from it. And as I was thinking about this on the way here, I was reminded of the story of the devil and his friend who were walking along the street, and ahead of them they saw a man who found something on the road that he became very excited and pleased about. And the devil's friend said to the devil, "What's he found that he's so happy with?" And the devil said, "Oh, he's found the truth." And the devil's friend said, "Well, isn't that bad for your business?" And the devil said, "Oh, no, it's good. I'm going to help him organize it." So that's rather how I feel trying to tackle how to organize these dialogues. So I'm going to begin with one that occurred on January the 5th, 1922. This is on page 211 of the Red Book. And in this dialogue, Jung complains to his soul that he's tired, and the soul won't let him sleep, and he's protesting. And he says to the soul, "Why are you keeping me awake?" And the soul says to him, "This is no time for you to sleep. The great work begins." The soul tells him that the work he has to do is going to be difficult, but he's been unconscious for too long. And the soul says this surprising phrase. The soul says, "To no longer be a Christian is easy, but what next? For more is yet to come." And the soul goes on to tell Jung that he's received a revelation that he must not hide. That's his true calling. And this calling should take priority. And the calling is the proclamation of the new religion, which is very surprising. Jung is very startled by this. He has no idea how to carry out the task, but the soul insists and says that no one knows it the way you do, and you have the requisite knowledge, and you should publish it, and so on. And so the problem becomes, first of all, is this real? Is Jungian psychology somehow the development of a new spirituality, a new religious practice? And then if it is, how on earth do we embody this knowledge in daily life? And the soul tells him this is not a rational process. The quote is, "The way is symbolic." So the symbolic manifestations of the soul become a main focus of analytical psychology. So this dialogue raises the question of whether Jung's psychology really is the beginning of a new form of spirituality which is starting to emerge alongside our existing traditions. And one of the major criticisms of the Freudian community and several other people of Jung was that he was trying to start a new religion. So that's what I want to discuss tonight. So let me begin with the soul's phrase suggesting that Jung is no longer a Christian. What does that mean? There's a great deal of Christian and biblical imagery in the Red Book. And I'll show you in a while, in one of the dialogues, there's a momentary identification with Christ. So what does it mean? Well, one meaning of this phrase is that we can't Christianize the unconscious. In other words, the unconscious can produce imagery in dreams, for example, that belongs to any mythological or religious tradition, not specifically the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Jung believes, of course, that this kind of imagery that we experience is indistinguishable from the experience of the unconscious. It's indistinguishable from what's usually known as religious experience. We cannot distinguish the experience of transpersonal layers of the unconscious from what is always called religious experience. The problem is that it can appear in a form that's quite surprising and startling. Anne Ulanov reports a dream of a man who finds himself very devoutly worshipping a giant pig in a temple. Okay? This is obviously not a Judeo-Christian image of the divine. But it's obviously this kind of imagery is linked to that individual's psychological structures. And when numinous imagery, imagery with a particular spiritual or divine quality appears from the unconscious, it links our personal psychology with the spiritual dimension. They become inseparable. And then religion becomes personal and internal. It's no longer projected onto some kind of external savior figure. It's found deeply in our own subjectivity. It's no longer the case, if Jung is right, that everything that we need is found in the Bible or in the church. Now, this is the fact that the unconscious can produce numinous imagery of the divine or the sacred or the holy, is very important for those of us for whom the Judeo-Christian tradition no longer contains a great deal of emotional power. If you have a sense of the sacred, but the Judeo-Christian tradition doesn't particularly appeal to you because of its God image or its politics, that kind of thing, then this approach of Jung can be very valuable because it means we can experience the transcendent dimension through the unconscious, in dreams, in visions, in synchronistic events, and also in our psychopathology. We have no need for prayer books or a liturgy or a hierarchy or anything like that. So that's one of the meanings that the soul has, I think, when it says that you're no longer a Christian. Jung is also not a Christian because he interprets the Christian story in his own way. For example, he says in various places, we can no longer load everything onto Christ. Every person has to carry God. That's his phrase. The descent of spirit into matter is complete. This is a quote. We must all do what Christ did. We must make our experiment. When we live like this, we know Christ as a brother, and God indeed becomes man. Then only does God become man in ourselves. Now this sounds like theology, but in this interview, Jung denies that he's a religious leader. He says he's just a philosopher or a psychologist who's trying to understand the manifestations of the unconscious. I think he got some of this idea from about the meaning of Christ in a conversation that he had with an anchorite called Ammonius in the Red Book. This is on page 272 of the Red Book. Ammonius says, we don't know the hidden meaning of the Gospels. Their meaning is yet to come. The idea is that religion proceeds in stages, and we only know the meaning of the previous stage when we're in the new stage. So according to Ammonius, we won't really understand Christianity till we move into the next religious manifestation. Now, Jung would always insist that he wasn't doing theology, that he was just an empirical observer of the psyche. But he sounds theological in several places. He makes many statements that are incompatible with traditional notions of a transcendent divinity. Here's one of them, quote, it was only quite late that we realized, or beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore last but not least man. That's a very powerful statement, which is actually consonant with all the non-dual spiritual traditions, like the Upanishadic traditions, which say, thou art that. And of course, the defining aspect of Jung's approach to religion is that he recalls all the gods, all the God images, back to their origin in the psyche. The experience of the numinous, of the divine or the sacred or the holy, is located deeply within our own subjectivity, within the psyche. And he intends these descriptions of numinous experience to be psychological and not metaphysical because they're empirical observations. And I want to spend the workshop tomorrow talking about a wide variety of different types of manifestations of the unconscious, different kinds of numinous manifestations. But Jung always will insist that he's not talking about the divine itself, that he's talking about people's experience of the divine and what the psyche says about the divine. He's not trying to impose a metaphysical system. Nevertheless, theologians are always very unhappy with Jung's insistence that the numinous can be radically immanent. They want to preserve the notion of the divine as in some kind of transcendent realm. And they want to insist that it's only accessible by means of the sacraments or the rituals of a particular institution or a particular priesthood. So the Vatican, for example, doesn't approve of Jung at all. There's a document issued by the Pontifical Council for Culture and the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue that mentions Jung and rejects Jungian psychology. They say it's much too New Agey. And they say that Jungian psychology is incompatible with Christianity. In this document, by the way, Jung is in very good company. They also don't like Teilhard de Chardin, they don't like William James and several other people. In fact, of course, Jung is a much greater threat to the religious establishment than Freud was. Freud simply tried to dismiss religion as illusory or a projection and so on. But what Jung is doing is not only insisting that religion is important, that the psyche or the human being has an innate form of spirituality, but he seems to offer an alternative to the established traditions by saying you can find it in yourself. Now, in his dialogues with the soul, he often, in the Red Book, he often contrasts the spirit of the times with the spirit of the depth. The spirit of the times is the system of rational thought that began with the Enlightenment and the worship of reason. And then the development of positivist science and materialism and so on. And one of the main points in the Red Book is that the spirit of the time, or an excessive emphasis on rationality, alienates us from our own depths, alienates us from symbolic thinking. So today, in contrast, Jung thinks that religion actually means collective consciousness or mass-mindedness, which is very dangerous to humanity. Everybody is told to believe the same thing, and religion has become part of the spirit of the times. And the only counterweight to this is to attend to the spirit of the depths, which meaning the objective psyche and the process of individuation, which is a spiritual journey. So Jung thinks that traditional collective religions like Christianity and Judaism and so on have lost the deeper meaning of their symbols by making them literal and historical and dogmatic. And what that does is it freezes the symbol and stops it being a true symbol, a living symbol. So collective religion has become part of the spirit of the times. It's either a matter of believing in some kind of dogma that everybody else is supposed to believe in, or it's about reading a book about what happened to somebody else a long time ago, what William James called second-hand religion. So in other words, he thinks that collective religion has severed us from our depths. And he's very concerned with individual experiences of the numinous. You remember that he'd seen from his father's experience that focus on belief and doctrine and dogma alone leads nowhere. Belief will easily crumble under the stress of adverse life situations. And what's important is that individual numinous experience is highly relevant to the psychology of the individual subject. And as he points out in a letter, they often have a healing effect. So for Jung, healing in psychotherapy is fostered by a numinous experience and by a religious attitude to the psyche, but not necessarily adherence to a particular tradition. And this attitude means paying attention to spontaneous numinous experience. And the problem for the traditions is that these experiences may not take a traditional form. So I'm thinking of a friend of mine who's a Franciscan priest who had a dream in which the Venus of Willendorf appeared to him in the sky. Now the Venus of Willendorf is a very old, one of the earliest known goddess figures from old Europe. It's from about 10,000 BCE. It's a sort of generic female figure with no particular facial features, a rather protuberant abdomen, and no feet, because it was used as a traveling altar that was stuck in the sand. But it's clearly a goddess image. And here's a man who's been worshipping the male sky god of Christianity all his life, and she appears to him in the sky. And he finds himself holding a communion cup, and he holds it up, and then milk starts to pour from the breast of the goddess into the communion cup. And he says, in the dream, I realized I was in the presence of something intensely holy. Now, if you're in a religious order, like this man happens to have been in the Franciscan order, this is not the kind of thing you talk about. But this is what Jung means when he says you can't Christianize the unconscious. This man is being told that the divine feminine, or the goddess, or the queen of heaven, is certainly crucially important to him, and that her nourishment and so on is sacramental for him. But it's an experience of the numinous which is completely different than the one he was raised to believe. That's the point about this. That's the contrast between this approach and a traditional approach. And traditional thinking would call this kind of imagery demonic, because it's so antithetical to the tradition. But it meets all the criteria for numinous experience, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But basically you'll remember that Jung borrows the notion of the numinous from Rudolf Otto, who was a Lutheran theologian who in 1917 wrote a book called Das Heilige, the Holy. It's translated into English as the idea of the holy, maybe an idea in the Platonic sense. He says, he gives a list of criteria for these kind of experiences. They're mysterious, tremendous, fascinating. The individual experiences dread or awe. So biblical examples would be Moses at the burning bush listening to God telling him to go free the people, or Saul on the road to Damascus hearing the voice of Jesus saying, "Why do you persecute me?" and so on. These are the kind of experiences that Otto is writing about, and that Jung was hearing in his consulting room in dreams like that. But whereas for Otto these experiences are experiences of the Judeo-Christian God, for Jung they're experiences of the transpersonal unconscious, the objective psyche, the autonomous psyche, and they may have nothing to do with traditional Judeo-Christian imagery. So there's a very stark contrast. This is why the Vatican is upset with Jung. Okay. Because if Jung is right, it broadens the God image. And it looks like, many of us now think, that there's a new God image emerging. And this is another way that Jung is not a Christian. He thinks that our collective God image is changing. So there's another dialogue with the soul in the Red Book where he says, our God images require renewal. Otherwise, quote, the God image becomes shadow and nonsense, and the greatest truth becomes the greatest lie. In other words, you cannot confine the God image that you have to Christ or the image of God in the Hebrew Bible or in the Quran or any of the traditions. It can include any manifestation of the self, the transpersonal self, including the dark side of the self, the feminine aspects of the self, and so on. But it's now presenting itself in completely new ways. That's his point. There's a dialogue in the Red Book which occurs after he has a vision of the death of the hero, where he kills Siegfried, the Germanic hero. In the 1925 seminars on this, he thinks this means that he's killed the inner hero, which for him was the intellect, or perhaps the thinking function, or something like that. But in the Red Book itself, he says that when the hero had been killed, he suddenly became aware of the birth of a new concept of God. So I think it was the old God image that he'd killed. He says, this God sank into his heart, and then the new image was born, quote, as a child from my own human soul, which had conceived him with resistance like a virgin. So against some resistance, a new God image is emerging, and he is apparently the herald of this new God image. Then he goes on to say that he hadn't realized that his soul had been pregnant with God. If you know Meister Eckhart, you can hear where this imagery comes from. He goes on to say this new God image couldn't come into being before the hero had been slain, because the hero is perfection. He is an enemy of God, because perfection has no need of God. He's here indirectly criticizing the New Testament phrase, "Be ye perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect." He says, the new God image laughs at people who try to imitate the hero and be perfect. The new God does not need imitation or discipleship. That's a very radical sort of anti-establishment position. He's trying to make the point that personal experiences of the numinous are much more important than just second-hand knowledge that you take from somebody else, that you learn in Sunday school or in a catechism class or something like that. That's all second-hand. What matters is personal, direct experience. And of course that wholeness is more important than perfection. He pays a great price for this. There's one horrifying act of imagination. This is page 290, 291. The soul insists that he eat the liver of a divine child who has just been killed. And of course this is horrifying for him. There's tremendous resistance to doing that, but he eventually finds that he has to do it. So what is the symbolic meaning of this? This is one of the problems with people who can't think metaphorically or symbolically. They want to take this stuff literally. And I'll show you where that leads in a minute. But the liver, in its symbolic sense, represents the seat of life, hence the etymology of the word liver. So eating means embodying and assimilating, making what you eat a part of yourself. So he has to assimilate the force of the old God image before you can really free yourself from the image. In other words, if I could say it in one line, before you can really embody the new God image, you really have to digest the old spiritual forms. You really have to understand what the old traditions were all about. Now, Jung believed that Nietzsche's idea about the death of the Christian God image, God is dead statement, heralds the age in which the experience of the self and the unconscious will replace the church as the vehicle of human religious experience. This is in the Zarathustra seminars. And he's wrestling with this throughout the Red Book. He's wrestling with this emergence of a new God image. For example, there's an important dialogue with Elijah and Salome. This is on page 245. And here he's told that the soul is bringing him this information about the new God image and the mysteries of his service. Now, why Elijah and why Salome? Well, Elijah, the biblical Elijah, was a defender of the traditional Hebrew Bible God image and represents tremendous antagonism to the introduction of any new God image. So, if Jung is going to introduce a new God image, he has to struggle with Elijah because Elijah would be his enemy. Salome, of course, is responsible for the death of John the Baptist, and John the Baptist announces the new God image in Christ. So these Elijah and Salome are very, very important associations for Jung. And I can see that he's struggling with this because he quotes a passage from Jeremiah, this is on page 259, where Jeremiah is warning against false prophets. And Jeremiah says, don't rely on dreams and individual revelations. And here's Jung doing exactly what Jeremiah said not to do. Okay, so he's clearly in some conflict about this. You'll remember his religious upbringing and so on. And remember that before Saint Jerome, about the end of the 4th century, there was a tradition of dreams sent by God. We see this in Matthew, where Joseph is told that Mary is conceived of the Holy Spirit, and he's warned in a dream that Herod is going to come to kill the children and so on. There are plenty of important dreams in the Bible. But then when Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin, while he was in the translation process, he had a terrifying dream in which he's brought before a divine court in heaven and accused of being a pagan and flogged mercilessly. And when he wakes up, he's so terrified that he revises his translation of the Bible. And there are passages in Deuteronomy and Leviticus that say you mustn't try and tell the future. That it's a commandment against augury. And he deliberately mistranslates the word augury as interpreting dreams, because of his own dream, which was so frightening for him. So from that moment, from the end of the 4th century, the tradition of working with dreams stopped, and the Christians just stopped paying attention to dreams, except for some contemporary Jungian Christians. But for a long time, they just started to ignore dreams because of St. Jerome. But that also was the admonition of Jeremiah. Do we need a new God image? What is the state of the contemporary God image? Is the contemporary God image working? We've had 2,000 years of Judaism and Christianity. It doesn't look to me as if it's working very well. Okay? The traditions give very good advice, very high-level spiritual teachings like love thy neighbor as thyself, turn the other cheek, and so on. But there's no point in giving this kind of high-level spiritual teaching if it doesn't correspond to the individual's psychological makeup. If you have a person who's full of rage and distress, maybe because of an abusive childhood or something like that, there's no point telling them to turn the other cheek. You're asking them to do something that it doesn't fit with their mental makeup. And that's the problem with much contemporary spiritual teaching. It only addresses consciousness. It ignores the unconscious of the individual. I'll give some more examples of that. So all the monotheistic traditions are insisting that they have the absolute truth and that their scripture is historically and literally true, and so on. And they all, and none of them will acknowledge that the whole thing is mythological. You know, the old joke, ours is religion, yours is mythology. But it's all mythology in the sense of a sacred story. It's a very dangerous inflation to say that your sacred text is the only correct one. There's no independent verification outside the text itself that will corroborate that kind of claim. And the price for insisting that your text is the only correct one is holy war, is conflict between the traditions. People killing other people with competing God image, fighting over land that they think is divinely given, and so on. And all theocracies are dangerously militaristic. Seems to be a characteristic of theocratic governments. Even this country had a president who was at least reported to have felt to have had divine justification for going to war. I'm not sure if those stories are true. So anyway, I'm trying to make the point that given the state of religion today and the conflict that it produces, that looking at Jung's alternative is worthwhile. The alternative suggests that the psyche is the source of religious experience, and this experience is irreducible. I'll talk tomorrow more about the issue of reducing this to hysteria or psychosis or something like that. But what I think has happened is that human beings have an innate organic spirituality, and that the monotheistic traditions have kind of hijacked it by insisting that theirs is the only way to express it. But we know, let's say the human species is 100 or 150,000 years old, and we know from cave paintings and burial practices and shamanic practices and stone monuments and so on, that human beings had a spirituality for at least 100,000 years before the Judeo-Christian tradition appeared. It seems to be an innate part of who we are as creatures. So it would be preferable to see each of our religious traditions as just one expression of this innate, organic, human religious impulse. Each can make its own contribution. Each arises from the mythopoetic level of the psyche. Each of them then is archetypally based, but none of them can represent the whole truth. When I say that the spirituality is organic, I mean He doesn't need theological preservatives. So, is Jungian psychology a religion? In a 1937 lecture given in New York, Jung addresses this question. He starts out by saying that the activation of the unconscious, as we're experiencing, is a new phenomenon. A few hundred years ago, the church used to take care of the unconscious. All the archetypal contents that people were in touch with, they experienced through the church. So the energy of the unconscious was contained dormant within the structures of the church. But since the Enlightenment, when the power of Christianity has begun to fade, the unconscious is freer, it's become more active, it's releasing more imagery. And this has become a compensation for the waning of the Christian tradition. And this is a lecture in which he says that life has left the churches and it will never go back. He says once the gods have left a temple, they never go back. So he thinks that our time is analogous to the time at the time of the Roman Empire, when Christianity was beginning to take over and paganism was beginning to die. It was a transitional period between two religious systems. He thinks that's happening now. Now, he says in that lecture that he doesn't want to think of analytical psychology as a religion in the sense of a creed or a set of dogmatic beliefs. And he criticizes always the Freudian tradition for being like that. Instead, he says psychotherapy could be called a religion, in his phrase, in statu nascendi, in a state of being born. It's something which is being born. He says, quote, "We stand on the threshold of a new spiritual epoch. From the depths of our own psychic life, new spiritual forms will be born." And Edward Edinger, a Los Angeles analyst, picked up on this idea in the 80s and said we are now on the cusp of what he called a new dispensation. Here the word dispensation means the way in which the divine grace is, as it were, dispensed into the world. So Edinger says we had the Hebrew dispensation where the law is given from on high, cast in stone. And then we have the Christian dispensation with a radical change of the God image into a God of love who incarnates, becomes human, and so on. And now he thinks there's a new dispensation, which is this sense that we're in touch directly with the objective psyche and that we experience individual numinous contents of the objective psyche. So this, he thinks, will be a new form of human spirituality. Essentially what Neumann called the ego-self-axis. In Max Zeller's book on dreams, I think it's called The Dream, the Vision of the Night, he reports a dream in which a huge temple is being built. And in the dream there are many, many people working on foundations for this new temple. It's just been started. And Zeller asks Jung, do you think this is the beginning of a new religion that's being built? And Jung replies to Zeller that he'd heard similar dreams, but he thought we were just at the beginning of this project and it would take several hundred years. So, if it's true, we're at a very early stage of this process. Now, I should mention that sometimes Jungians are very uncomfortable with the notion that Jungian psychology is a spiritual practice. They get anxious about it. They feel like there's something wrong with the idea. It's kind of it's a forbidden topic if you want to think of psychology and psychotherapy in purely secular terms. For a long time it wasn't kosher, if I can mix metaphors, to talk about religion or spirituality during psychotherapy. I had a supervisor who used to say, if the patient mentions something about religion, just sit quietly and wait for something important to come up. But then the last maybe 20 years, it's become more and more acceptable because, of course, people are realizing that this is a very important aspect of people's lives. Now, Jung, of course, was criticized heavily by theologians. The outstanding example is by Martin Buber, who accused Jung of trying to reduce the transcendent divine to nothing but something intrapsychic, which Buber called psychologism. Okay. In other words, he's reducing spirit to psyche. And Jung's response to this, to Buber, was, you don't understand, Martin, you don't understand the reality of the psyche. If somebody has a I'm paraphrasing obviously, if somebody has a numinous experience, the psyche is real, so the experience is real. So the fact that we have these new God images is not to say that they are, quote, just psychological and therefore not real, but on the contrary, they're very, very real. Okay, so he said, I'm just pointing out the empirical observation that the great mystery manifests itself in the psyche, which is why John Dowley wrote a book called Psyche as Sacrament. The psyche is a medium by which the sacred can manifest itself. But because the theologians never understood the notion of the reality of the psyche, and because they were wedded to a specific traditional God image, they could never really accept this approach. They couldn't accept it that you could locate an image of God in your own subjectivity. And of course, if you're a conservative theologian, you can't tolerate the idea that the divine can manifest itself in ways that don't correspond to the way you teach that it should manifest. And of course, the psychologists didn't like what Jung was doing, especially Erich Fromm and many of the Freudians, because they didn't like the idea of the unconscious being turned into a religious phenomenon. So Jung was criticized both by the theologians and by the psychologists. But he keeps saying, I'm only interested in the psychology of religious experience. I'm not making ontological or metaphysical claims about the nature of the divine. I'm just showing you that I can demonstrate empirically that this imagery occurs. Whether there is a transcendent divinity beyond the psyche is not something that we can answer from within the province of psychology. In other words, you can't, so if you have one of these new God images, you really can't say whether that's a transcendent divine using the psyche as a medium of transmission, sort of coming through the psyche, or whether it's just the psyche itself is synonymous with the divine. There would be no way of making that distinction. All he would say is that there's a consistent psychological relationship between the self and the divine, and we know that because of the numinosity of these images. I think another advantage of Jung, which I'll talk about tomorrow, is that he gives us a new vocabulary for talking about spirituality. For example, we know that the core of the complex is an archetype. And there's an archetypal strand at the core of your complexes, at the core of your emotional difficulty. And Jung says in a couple of places that the archetype is a tool of God or an organ of God. Now, if that's correct, then that means there's an organ of God or an element of the divine at the core of your painful complexes. That's a very radical idea. It means that the divine is present right in the center of your emotional suffering. I'll amplify that a bit more tomorrow. In other words, the personality is permeated essentially with spiritual principles. The archetypes are not only organizing principles, they're spiritual principles. So when you're struggling with a painful complex, you're actually struggling with the dark side of the self, or the dark side of the archetype. And I think that makes psychotherapy a spiritual practice, and much more than just a secular pursuit. Now let me go on to one of the more difficult aspects of the Red Book. I want to go back to this section where Jung is talking about the birth of a new symbol within himself. This is a quote. He says, "This symbol is the divine Son who is the supreme meaning, the passing over into a new creation." He says, "I'm not the supreme meaning itself, but the symbol becomes in me such that it has its substance and I mine." This is the important line. "Thus I stand like Peter in worship before the miracle of the transformation and the becoming real of the God in me." He goes on to say that he's not the Son of God himself, but he represents this Son. And then he says something which is really quite puzzling. He says, "I am one, therefore, to whom in the name of God the freedom of the binding and loosing has been given. The binding and loosing takes place in me." This is a reference to Matthew 18:18. "Whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever ye loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." In other words, that when the apostles write and speak in a way that when they're moved by the Holy Spirit, binding and loosing means allowing or disallowing. So what they allow or disallow will be ratified in heaven or condemned in heaven. And now here's Jung saying, "I'm like Peter, and this is happening in me." This is a very radical kind of statement, and it makes you quite worried about whether he's becoming very inflated. He says, "This binding and loosing takes place in him, but also through him in the world. It doesn't happen according to his own will, and it's unavoidable. This occurs through his transformation. He is the servant of this transformation, like the Pope." And that's his phrase. Now, the Roman Catholic Church bases its papal system on Matthew 16:19, which says, "And so I tell you, Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock foundation I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What you bind or forbid on earth will be prohibited in heaven, and what you loose or permit on earth will be loosed or permitted in heaven." So Peter is supposed to be the first pope with this special authority. Now, if we were to take this allusion literally, it sounds as if Jung is seeing himself as the Pope of the new religion. It could be read like that. But I want to try and show that I don't think that's really what's going on here. I'm just afraid it could be interpreted in that way. This is an image from it's opposite page 125 in the Red Book. And interestingly, it's opposite the text on the other side of the page is titled "The Three Prophecies." Now, as I look at this figure, I see it divided into three. The top mandala, this fiery cross, looks to me as if it represents the self. I'm talking about the self with a capital S, the transpersonal self. The lower imagery looks like everyday human life. You just see houses and buildings and whatnot. And then in the middle, there's a human figure. And the human figure seems to me to be mediating between the two levels. And if I can walk closer to this, but over here... Oh, thank you. I'm frightened of pulling the whole house down. Thanks. There's some kind of container here. It looks like a vase or vessel of some kind. And it looks to me as if this divine energy, this celestial energy, is pouring into the crown of the human figure. That's how I would read that. And I think this indicates to me that he felt inspired when he got this material. That this is Jung's experience of receiving the Red Book, that it really is a revelation, as the soul told him at the beginning. I don't know how else to read that figure. But he keeps saying, I don't think he is too inflated. He keeps saying, I'm not on a par with my visions. I don't believe I'm significant just because I see what is significant. He says, I know it's incredible, but it's not me, it's the symbol which is important. Carrie Fink, who was an analysand of Jung, who transcribed the Red Book in 1924 and 1925, used to talk to Jung about it and then made notes afterwards. Originally, she wrote them in the form of letters that she didn't actually send. And she says that Jung told her that he was sure that Philemon, the Philemon figure, the Philemon figure was the same figure who inspired Buddha and Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, and Christ and Muhammad, and all these figures communed with God. But she said that Jung said that these figures identified with this figure, and Jung refused to do so. He said he wanted to remain a psychologist, somebody who's trying to understand the process psychologically. Now, if you look at the top left, over there, this text is a quotation. I'm sure you can't see it clearly, but this text is actually a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita. And for some reason it's translated into English from the Sanskrit. Why it wasn't translated into German, I don't know. Maybe there was no German translation. But this is the only English text in the Red Book. And it's in this quotation, the god Krishna says he will incarnate whenever the world needs him, implying that Krishna, the god Krishna and Philemon are somehow the same figure. Or at least they're related in some way. So Fink says that she thinks that Jung could have used this material to become a kind of new prophet, but he chose to use the material to enrich the field of psychology and not to turn it into a religion. These wings, by the way, that Philemon has are kingfisher wings. And in ancient Greece, the dried body of a kingfisher was said to ward off storms. And the kingfisher was also said to have the gift of prophecy. Now, lots of critics have raised the question of whether Jung was consciously and deliberately trying to start a new religion. In Kerr says Jung wants to develop a new religion in order to justify the betrayal of his wife and the seduction of Sabina Spielrein. And Kerr says Jung needed to conceive a better religion that wouldn't condemn him for his sins. Maclean's biography of Jung says Jung was a prophet and his followers developed the legend of Jung as a man-god. And so on. So this is a typical kind of criticism. The extreme example is Noel. This is Jung's description. This is Noel's description of Jung's psychology. He says it's, quote, an anti-orthodox Christianity cult of redemption or a Nietzschean religion, a secret church, a pagan form of personal religion. Jung is waging war against Christianity and its distant, absolute, unreachable God, and is training his disciples to listen to the voice of the dead, worship the sun, and become gods themselves. I must say I missed that piece in my training somehow. Maybe there was an inner circle. Noel says, are we witnessing the birth of another religious movement? Are we witnessing the incipient stages of a faith based on the apotheosis of God, of Jung as a God-man? Only history will tell if Jung's Nietzschean religion will finally win its Kulturkampf, its struggle with culture, and replace Christianity with its own personal religion of the future. So Noel is extremely critical. Noel writes that Jung's essay New Paths in Psychology is the equivalent of a political pamphlet of Lenin, which calls for the formation of a revolutionary party. And according to Noel, in this essay, Jung is calling for an intrapsychic overthrow of custom, a revolution in the European traditions that enslave the individual personality. that Jung is trying to overthrow the neurosis-inducing Judeo-Christian religion and its sex-fixated ethics by establishing a new religion. In case you wondered what we were all doing here. The religion of psychoanalysis. And Jung says that a secret church is being spread, which Jung established, and through which he transmitted his charismatic authority. Jung is, this is also known, Jung developed his psychological method and organizational plans along the model of the ancient mysteries, recruiting former patients and Jung worshippers, primarily women, to be the high priests of his new religion. Jung is fueling fascination with witchcraft and the occult, and is the source of inspiration for the neo-pagan religious movements, and so on and so on. It's quite extraordinary. So there are various reasons why Noel is upset with Jung. Some of them are personal, and some of them are based on this active imagination. This is on page 252 of the Red Book. You'll recognize this from the frontispiece to Ion, volume 9 of the collected works. In this active imagination, a black serpent appears, and Jung spreads his arms wide in a kind of identification with Christ. And then Salome appears, and the serpent winds itself around Jung's body, and Jung's face is transformed into a lion. And Salome tells him that he's Christ. Now, in the 1925 seminars, some years later, Jung says that Salome's worship of him is that side of the inferior function that is surrounded by an aura of evil. He says this experience feels like madness, and it is madness, but one has to surrender to the unconscious. In other words, he goes on to say this was an active imagination. It shouldn't be taken literally. And the mistake that Noel is making when he reads this is that he's taking this stuff literally. He doesn't understand that this is a symbolic, actually it was a symbolic initiation. This figure is a Mithraic figure of a lion-headed god, the so-called Deus Leontocephalus. Okay, so in other words, Jung is symbolically being initiated into both Mithraism and Christianity, both at the same time. Why is that important? Because the Mithraic religion and the Christian religion were hostile to each other in the early years. There was a lot of tension between them. And in this active imagination, the two opposites are joined together in this one symbol. It's a rather important initiation. The initiate is reconciling these opposites. And then Jung goes on to say, if you don't understand this, you are either in the society of the gods or you're in the lunatic society. Okay? He's very clear that he's not in the lunatic society, that this is an active imagination, that it's a symbolic experience. But Noel insists that this is a literal experience, and says that Agnella Jaffe, when she edited Memories, Dreams, Reflections, she deliberately suppressed this material. Because Noel says that Jung believed that he had actually and literally become deified, and this makes him an Aryan Christ, which is the title of one of Noel's books. In other words, Noel says that Jung believed that this active imagination had turned him into a god. And that this lion-headed god was a kind of secret internal god image that Jung had. And Noel says that Jung and his followers realize this truth and are concealing it from all the world. Okay. Now this is very concrete, pre-symbolic thinking. It's the thinking of somebody with no symbolic capacity. Because if you look at this symbolically, it's a symbolic initiation. It has nothing to do with literal deification. And there are developmental reasons why people are pre-symbolic. But basically the pre-symbolic personality is unable to use symbol and metaphor, has no as-if capacity, and wants to literalize everything. So Noel is writing as if this was a kind of literal transformation into a god, instead of it being a symbolic initiatory experience. I mention all this because the Red Book is out there, and I'm very concerned that if somebody picks this up and doesn't understand its symbolic meaning, that they could make the same mistake that Noel is making. And I also think, of course, that Noel is wildly exaggerating the effects that Jung had on his followers. There are many followers of Jung who over-idealize him, but I don't think they actually worship him. Oh, could you turn that off? Thank you. Thanks. So there's no evidence that this fantasy that Noel thinks happened actually shaped Jung's self-understanding, or that he took it literally. I don't think he did at all. I think it's true that Jung thinks that numinous experiences of the archetypal level of the psyche are personal forms of revelation. But he always says that it's very important to overcome the experience of godlikeness and not set one up as a prophet or world redeemer. He says that in several places. He's very aware of the danger of inflation. You can see it in the Zarathustra seminar, where he points out in several places that identification with the numinous leads to dangerous inflation or psychosis. Okay? That's what he thinks happened to Nietzsche. So Noel is constantly ignoring the fact that Jung is constantly warning against the thing that Noel is accusing Jung of. So there is a momentary identification with Christ in this act of imagination, but what he later says this means is living life fully, and that Christ is a model of the individuation process, that you live out your individuation process to the bitter end. It doesn't mean that he literally felt that he'd become Christ in a sort of external sense. I should probably finish so we can have some questions. So let's get to the bottom line. Is analytical psychology a new religion? It depends how you define religion. It doesn't have an organized community. There's a lot of disorganized communities. It doesn't have worship services. It doesn't have a specific God image. It doesn't have a creation myth, like the Garden of Eden or Genesis or something. It doesn't have an ethical system. It doesn't have a set of commandments. So it's not a religion in any of those senses. But I think it can substitute for organized religion because it can be a spiritual approach to the psyche. One can turn to the psyche, to dreams and so on for guidance. And I think that for many of us, seeing the self as an image of the divine in the psyche is very close to thinking of it as the divine itself, in a kind of non-anthropomorphic form. And that's why the English analyst Anthony Storr said to him that Jung said to Anthony Storr, every night you have the chance of the Eucharist. In other words, every night you can go to bed and have a dream in which one of these numinous experiences of the self and a new God image might appear to you. All right, well, I think we should stop and take a break. And who's in charge here?